Okay, so for today we're going to be looking at clauses that are a little bit more complicated, and it may be easier for you to print out the practice sheet for today, or you're welcome to pull it up online. I'll give you a brief little introduction in how to do both. As for right now, I have printed it out. So make sure that you have your conjunctions where you can see those, because remember, our subordinating conjunctions are really important because if they start off your clause, then they make your clause dependent. So we definitely want to pay attention to our subordinating conjunctions because that's going to let us know if our clause is dependent. Okay, our coordinating conjunctions are also important. They're a little bit easier because there are only 7 and you can remember them by reminding yourself fanboys, and that will help you get them all listed. They do not make your clause independent or dependent. So they are still important and necessary because after we have a good understanding of clauses, we are going to talk about some errors that occur if people do not use the conjunctions correctly. So below this is just a quick little review of what a clause is. So a clause can be really short or it can be really long. The only thing that it has to have in order to be a clause is a subject and verb. So if you have both of those, then you have a clause. Then you need to decide if you have an independent or a dependent clause. So we're going to know if we have a dependent clause if we have one of our subordinating conjunctions. So subordinating conjunctions, there's a little bit of review. There is a little bit of a tricky part with our conjunctions because some of our conjunctions can be prepositions instead. So like here in example A, this is not a clause. This is a prepositional phrase. And the way that you're going to know that is we only have one subject and one verb. So this does not have a clause with it. So because it doesn't have a clause with it, we know that's a preposition and not a conjunction. So we don't have any subordinating conjunctions in that sentence. So that one just has one independent clause. It does have a comma there because when you start a sentence with a prepositional phrase, you do put a comma. Okay, our example B, it has because again, and it's a very similar sentence. This time, though, that's a subject, that's a verb, that's a subject, that's a verb. Here, because it comes with a subject and verb, it is a subordinating conjunction, and that means this clause is dependent and this clause is independent. And we do have a comma because remember here are our comma rules. So when our clauses come in this order, we know to add a comma. So if you have 2 independent clauses, you add that comma before the coordinating conjunction. Then if your dependent clause comes first, you put a comma at the end of that clause. And independent and then dependent is most of the time no comma. After we look at some complicated sentences, we're going to be talking about a run-on. So a run-on is when somebody puts 2 sentences together and they don't put a conjunction. And this is a very common error that students make because these 2 sentences are very short. So it doesn't really look like there's a problem here. But our issue comes in because we've got Marcia bought and they were. So we do have 2 clauses. Anytime you have clauses put together, you've got to have a conjunction. And so because this is missing a conjunction, it's an error. So this person kind of stuck a comma between there, but a comma is not the same thing as a conjunction. So you do have a couple of ways to fix a run-on that are actually pretty easy, and you do want to use a variety of ways. So you could put a period here, capitalize that, and you've got 2 sentences. You can add a comma and a conjunction, so you would just pick a conjunction that makes sense. So we've got Marcia bought 2 sweaters, and then maybe because they were on sale, so then we're actually adding a subordinating conjunction, and that would be independent and then dependent, and we wouldn't need a comma. And or really the best way to fix this one is to do a semicolon, which is just a comma with a period over it. So that is very similar to a conjunction, and the purpose of that is it shows I put these two sentences together because they relate, and we can see that definitely these two sentences have a relationship, so the semicolon makes sense to put those two together. Okay. The other error that students make is sometimes having an incomplete sentence, and it's called a fragment. You can't have a dependent clause by itself. So here, because is starting off that sentence, so that would be an incomplete sentence. You will see fiction writers, if they're trying to be creative, they might have a dependent clause and leave it by itself, but they're doing that for a reason. But in more formal writing, you want to avoid breaking those rules, so you wouldn't want to leave this alone. You would want to add an independent clause to it. Here, this, of course, we can obviously tell that's pretty informal, and the issue with that is that there's no verb in that sentence. So we're going to do some practice with our more complicated clauses. The first thing that you need to do to make sure that you don't make any errors is really look for all of your subjects and verbs and label those. So we've got whether, gets, I, am, and it gets. And if you are not familiar with verbs, there is a sheet in the study sheets that talks about verbs, so you may want to review those. Okay, so we actually, since we've got 3 sets of subjects and verbs, we've got 3 clauses. And we do need to talk about this. So to be, if you look at your list of verbs, be is actually a verb. But anytime you have to and then a verb together, it is something called an infinitive. And that means that it takes a verb and changes it to something else. So if you see that, don't label it as a verb, because that will mess up how many clauses you have. Okay, then let's look for our subordinating conjunctions. So here's one. Makes that first clause dependent. Okay, second clause, we don't have any subordinating conjunctions, so this one is independent. Then we get over here, oh, I didn't label this subject and verb, so label I plan is a subject and verb. Okay, here we've got a little bit of a crazy situation going on because we've got 2 conjunctions actually back to back. So but is coordinating, when is subordinating. So it makes this clause dependent. Okay, then this last clause doesn't have a subordinating conjunction with it, so it's independent. Then we want to look back, and we're just going to do a quick check and make sure that we have conjunctions that join all of our clauses. So as is joining these first 2. So we've put those 2 together, and it's joining those, so that's correct. Okay, when is actually joining this clause and this clause. So these 2 clauses are joined by when, and then but joins these first 2 clauses with the last 2 clauses. So we do have enough conjunctions. Everything is joined correctly. Okay, now we need to go back and think about commas. So dependent, independent, we would put a comma, and I'm just circling it so that you can see since commas are little. All right, then we have independent, dependent, which normally we wouldn't have a comma, but remember this is kind of being joined on to this independent clause, so we do need a comma here. Okay, then when it gets too hot, we've got dependent going into independent, so we also need a comma here. So this is a pretty complicated sentence, and really if you label all of your subjects and verbs, that will hopefully help you see sentences that have multiple clauses. Okay, so we're going to do this second one together. We've got sentences have is our subject and verb. Students should make subject and verb. And they review subject and verb. So we've got 1, 2, 3 clauses. So our first one ends here. Then we have this one. So we've got this first one with no subordinating conjunction, so that one's going to be independent. We've got a coordinating conjunction here, so that one is going to be independent. Then our last one does have a subordinating conjunction, so it's going to be dependent. Now we need to go back and think about commas. We have two independent, so we are going to put a comma before our coordinating conjunction. And then we have independent going into dependent, so no comma here. Okay, I'm going to let you do these on your own a little bit later, and I'm going to talk about the ones here at the bottom. Okay, the ones here at the bottom are challenging because they have a clause that interrupts another clause. So once again, we want to try to label our subjects and verbs, and it does get a little confusing. I find it easier to find the verbs and then go back and get the subjects that go with them. So our two verbs here are was and lands. So then we've got the butterfly that was in our garden often lands on that flower. Okay, so